I had the shot. That's the thing I have to live with. When the king went down, I had him dead center in my lens, sharp, lit, the picture of a lifetime, and I'm going to tell you why I didn't take it, and why a guard named Pell is the reason I can still look at myself. Let me start it where it started, though, because the moment only lands if you've stood where I stood. I'm a press photographer. Was mostly by then. I'd been doing royal work for 26 years, which in that trade makes you a fossil. I'd photographed 3 coronations. I'd done the weddings, the funerals, the balcony waves, the lot. I knew the rota, the pens, the other shooters, the whole grim machinery of it. And I'll be honest with you up front, because the story doesn't work if I pretend to be better than I was. I'd gone a bit cold. You do after 26 years. The royals stop being people to you and start being product. A good frame, a bad frame, did you get the moment or did you miss it? That's all it is after a while. That's all it was to me that day. I'll give you an example so you know exactly the kind of man I'd become. Years back I was at a funeral, a royal one, won't say whose, and there was a child in the procession, very young, having to walk behind a coffin in front of the whole world, and the child's face went, just for a second, the way a child's does when it's all too much. And I got it. Beautiful frame, heartbreaking. It ran everywhere, paid for a kitchen extension. And I did not feel one single thing taking it. I clocked the light, I clocked the focus, I pressed the shutter, and I was already turning for the next frame before the child had finished its grief. That's what the job does to you if you let it. It puts a pane of glass between you and everything, and after a while you forget the glass is there, and you think the cold, flat thing you see through it is just how the world is. I'd been behind that glass so long I'd stopped noticing I couldn't feel anything through it. I tell you that not to make you hate me, though you can if you like. I tell you because it's the only way you'll understand what it meant later, when the glass broke. I knew the rota, the pens, the other shooters, the whole grim machinery of it. The day was the king's 500th. I should explain that because it sounds like nothing and it was actually the whole thing. In Marienburg's small kingdom, old, the sort of place that keeps proper count of things, they tally a monarch's public engagements, always have. It's a point of pride, this idea that the king works, that the crown earns its keep one ribbon cutting and hospital visit at a time. And King Tobias had reached his 500th public engagement of the year. In 1 year, 500. The papers had been building it for weeks, the hardest working monarch in Europe, the old king who never stopped. There was going to be a thing at Caldermoor House, the royal residence out past the river, a garden reception, the press all invited, the lot. A celebration of an old man's devotion to duty. He was 76, that matters, hold on to that. Caldermoor's not the grand palace in the city, that's where the state business happens. Caldermoor's the older place, lower, softer, all weathered stone and big cedar trees and lawns that run down to the water, the residence the family actually likes, where they go to breathe. They don't usually let the press pass the gates. That day they did, because that day was about being seen working, and a celebration nobody photographs isn't a celebration, it's just a party. It was September, one of those gold September afternoons that England does about 4 times a year to make up for the rest of it. Warm, but with the first edge of autumn under it. The cedars throwing long shadows across the lawn, bees in the lavender by the terrace, a string quartet sawing away politely near the house, and maybe 300 guests, charity people, ambassadors, the ones who get invited to these things, all in their good clothes, holding their drinks, waiting for the king to come out and do his 500th. We were penned, the press, off to one side of the terrace where we'd been told to stand. Maybe a dozen of us. I knew most of them. There was a young one, a girl called Sadie, first big royal job, vibrating with nerves, kept checking her settings over and over. I remember being faintly annoyed by her, the way you are by someone who still cares. There was a TV crew. And there was the whole bank of long lenses. All of us pointed at the terrace doors, waiting for the man to appear so we could turn his 500th into product. Now the guards. Marienburg's Royal Guard, the king's own, they're called, aren't the bearskin and scarlet tourist sort, not at Caldermoor. At a private residence they're closer, plainer, harder, dark uniforms, less standing still, more watching. And there was one in particular posted near the terrace doors, near where the king would come out, and I'd half noticed him the way you half notice anyone when you're waiting, a big steady fella, older than most of them, 50s maybe, with a stillness to him but not the show stillness of the tourist guards. A working stillness. A man paying attention. I found out his name later. Sergeant Aaron Pell. 20 years on the king's own, the last 8 of them on close protection, which means he was one of the small handful of men who actually stood near the king, day in, day out, close enough to catch him. That's a particular kind of job. You're furniture, mostly. You stand near a man for years and you're not allowed to be a person to him. You're a function, a presence, a pair of eyes, but you see everything. You see the man behind the king in a way nobody else does, the tiredness, the private face, the moments between the public ones. And Pell, I'd learn, had been seeing something for months that nobody else had let themselves see. Because here's the thing about King Tobias and his 500 engagements, the thing the papers turned into a lovely story about devotion, the thing that was actually something else entirely. The man was not well. I didn't know that afternoon. Nobody outside a very small circle knew it. The official line was that the king was in robust health for his age, never stopped, marvelous old boy. And he'd kept that line going by sheer will, by pushing himself to 500 engagements in a year that would have flattened a man half his age, because, and I only understood this later, when it all came out, because he decided that the day he was seen to slow down was the day people started waiting for him to die, and he wasn't going to give them that. He'd rather work himself into the ground than be pitied. Pride, you'd call it, or duty. With men like that, the two get so tangled you can't pull them apart. Pell knew. Of course Pell knew. You can't stand 8 years that close to a man and not know when he's failing. He'd watched the king get slower on the stairs. He'd watched him grip the backs of chairs that he passed, casual, like he was just resting a hand, when really he was steadying himself. He'd watched him go gray and breathless after engagements and wave the doctors off. Pell had been quietly closing the distance for months, standing a half step nearer than protocol wanted, positioning himself on the king's weak side, getting ready, every single day, to catch a fall that everyone else was pretending wasn't coming. I got the rest of this later from people who'd worked alongside him, and it's worth telling you now because it's the spine of the whole thing. Pell had gone to people. That's the part that makes him more than just a quick pair of hands. Months before, he'd gone quietly, through the right channels, the way a sergeant has to, and he'd said the king needs to slow down. The engagements are too many. He's not well and he's hiding it, and one day he's going to go down in public. And he'd been told, more or less, to mind his post, not his job to have opinions on the king's diary. There were doctors for that, and equerries and private secretaries, and none of them were a close protection sergeant. Thank you very much. The machine closed over him the way the machine does. So Pell did the only thing left to a man who's seen the thing coming and isn't allowed to stop it. He got ready to be there when it landed. Think about that for a second. He couldn't prevent it. They wouldn't let him. So he just decided he would not let the king hit the ground. That was the one piece of it inside his control, and he took that piece and he held it every day for months. He learned the king's weak side. He learned the slow times, the after-lunch dip, the way the old man would tank toward the end of a long engagement. He shifted his stance, his distance, his whole footing, 100 tiny adjustments nobody noticed, so that on the day, whichever day it turned out to be, he'd be moving before anyone else had even understood there was something to move toward. That's not luck. People called it lightning reflexes afterward, a miracle, right place, right time. It wasn't. It was months of a man quietly preparing to catch something everyone else refused to admit was falling. So the terrace doors open, the quartet stops, everyone turns, and out comes King Tobias to do his 500th. I want to slow this part right down because it happened slow, even though it was over in under a minute. That's a thing about the worst moments, they stretch. Time gets long and thick and you see everything. He came out and the applause started, and at first it was fine. He lifted his hand. He had the wave, that economical little royal wave, decades of practice in it. And the 300 guests were beaming up at him, glasses raised, and the September sun was full on the terrace, and it should have been a lovely thing, an old man being thanked for a lifetime of turning up. Beside me in the pen, the young one, Sadie, breathed out, "Oh, he's actually here, that's actually him." The way you do at your first one when they're still real to you, when the glass hasn't gone up yet. And I remember thinking with the cold, flat part of me, "Get your shot, love, stop narrating it." But I was watching him through the long lens, and the long lens shows you things the eye misses. The eye saw a king waving. The lens saw the sweat at his hairline that shouldn't have been there on a mild day. The lens saw the wave come a half-beat slow, like a recording running not quite at speed. The lens saw his free hand find the back of that chair by the doors and grip it, not rest on it, grip it, the knuckles going pale, and stay there a moment too long before he made himself let go and step toward the microphone. And I saw Pell move, just slightly, just a single step, casual as anything, drifting in from the edge of the terrace toward the king's left side, his eyes never leaving the old man. Nobody else clocked it. Why would they? A guard taking a step. But I've been photographing royal events for 26 years, and some part of me, under all the cold, knew the choreography of these things cold, knew where every guard was meant to stand, and that wasn't where Pell was meant to stand. He was out of position, deliberately closing the gap. I should have understood right then what that meant. I didn't. I just thought, idly, the way you think when you're hunting for a frame, "He looks tired, poor old boy," and I lifted my camera. 300 guests started to applaud, properly now, a swell of it, as he reached the microphone. The quartet struck up something celebratory. Somebody near the front called out, "500, Your Majesty." And there was laughter, warm laughter, and the king lifted his hand to acknowledge it, and stepped forward to the little microphone they'd set up for him to say a few words. And I watched, through my lens in sharp gold focus, as King Tobias of Marienburg opened his mouth to speak. And the light went out of his eyes. I've seen it since in my head 1,000 times, frame by frame, because I had it framed. The smile didn't drop. That's the eerie thing. The trained smile stayed on his face even as his eyes went somewhere else, even as his knees stopped holding him, and he went down, not a dramatic fall, not backwards, just a slow folding. A man whose strings had been cut, crumpling toward the stone terrace in front of 300 guests and a dozen cameras and the whole watching world. There was a sound from the crowd, not a scream. Worse than a scream, that low collective "oh" that 300 people make at once when something tips over that shouldn't. The sound of a whole reception understanding, in the same half-second, that the lovely afternoon has just stopped being lovely. The quartet stumbled and died mid-phrase, one violin carrying on a note longer than the others before it cut. A glass smashed somewhere as somebody dropped it, and the king kept folding, slow, terribly slow, the sash bright against the gray of his going-down face. And every single one of those cameras came up, including mine. Reflex, 26 years of reflex. The king is falling and you raise the camera, that's the job, that's the animal in you that the job has trained, you get the shot, you always get the shot. I had him, dead center, sharp, the light perfect, his face turned just so, the picture that pays for the rest of your life and runs on every front page on earth. My finger was on the shutter. I want you to understand, I was a quarter-second from taking it. The cold, flat man behind the glass already had it half taken. But somebody got there first. Not a doctor, not the equerry, not the men in suits who are supposed to materialize. Before the king had finished falling, before he hit the stone, there was a dark shape moving faster than anything that size should move, and Sergeant Aaron Pell crossed that terrace in the time it takes to gasp, and got under him and caught him. caught a falling king in his arms, going down to one knee under the weight to take it gently, cradling the old man's head so it didn't crack on the stone, all of it in one motion, like he'd done it 100 times because in his head, getting ready for months he had. I heard him land, the knee hitting the terrace, the grunt of taking a grown man's whole weight. He'd got there with maybe an inch to spare. An inch. Months of getting ready, and it came down to 1 inch between the king's skull and the stone, and Pell's hand was in that inch, his palm flat against the back of the old man's head, taking it. And then Pell did the thing I'll never forget, the thing this whole story is really about. He looked up, still holding the king, and he found us, the press pen, the dozen long lenses, all of us with the king's collapse framed and our fingers on the shutters, and on his face was not panic and not the blankness of a guard doing his duty. It was fury, and it was a plea both at once. And he said one word, loud, raw, the only word he had time for, holding a dying-looking king in his arms while a dozen cameras drank it in. Don't. Here's the thing about that word, it shouldn't have worked. We were press. That's what we were there for. A king had just collapsed in front of the world, and that is news. That is the definition of news, and there is no law and no guard and no one word that's supposed to stop a dozen professionals doing the only thing 26 years had trained them to do. If you told me the morning of that day that a guard would say don't and a press pen would lower its cameras, I'd have laughed at you. It doesn't happen. We don't lower the camera. The camera is the whole point of us. And yet, I've thought about why it worked, and I think it's this. It wasn't an order. That's what would have failed. If he'd shouted stop or no photographs, official, a command, every one of us would have kept shooting, because you don't take orders from a guard and because the shot's worth more than the telling off. But don't isn't an order. Don't is a person asking another person. There was no authority in it at all. There was just a man on one knee holding another man who might be dying, looking at us and asking us, please, as one human being to a row of them, not to do the thing we were about to do. And it cut straight through the glass. I felt it go. That's the only way I can describe it. 26 years of glass between me and the world, and that one raw word went through it like it was nothing. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not a photographer looking at product. I was a man, looking at another man holding a third man, and the third man was old and frightened, and his strings had been cut in front of 300 people. And the dignity of him, the whole dignity of a life, was about to be taken by me and 11 others, and turned into a front page, into a clip, into the image of King Tobias as a broken old thing folding onto stone, the image that would replace every other image of him forever. The one they'd use when he died, and the one his grandchildren would see for the rest of their lives. I lowered the camera. I didn't decide to exactly. My arms just came down, and the strangest thing, when I looked along the pen, blinking, half ashamed, expecting to be the only soft fool who'd flinched, half of them had lowered too. Sadie, the young one, had her camera right down at her side and both hands over her mouth, and tears just running openly, not even wiping them. The TV cameraman had tilted his lens up to the cedars, deliberate, filming leaves. Old Marcus from the agency, harder even than me, had turned his back on the whole thing, which I'd never seen a shooter do in my life. Not all of them. I won't lie to you and say all of them. 2 or 3 kept firing. There's always 2 or 3, and I'm not even sure I blame them. The animal's strong, but the bank of us, the wall of long lenses that should have devoured that old man, mostly came down. Because of one word, from one guard, who'd cared enough about the man, not the king, the man, to ask. Then the suits arrived, the way they always eventually do. A half-second too late to matter, the equerry, the protection detail, a doctor running across the lawn with his bag, and they got a screen up. One of those folding privacy things, fast, around the king and Pell, and the moment closed behind it, and we were left standing in the pen with our cameras down and 300 guests in shock, and the quartet's music sheets blowing off their stands across the empty terrace. They got him inside, Ambulance came round the back, away from us, which was the point of the screen, not just to block the cameras, but to give them a covered route. He was alive. Word came out fairly quick, through the equerry, the standard thing. His Majesty had felt unwell, was receiving medical attention, more information in due course. Alive. That was the main thing. Pell had got him to the inch, and the doctor had got him breathing right, and the old king was alive. I drove home that night, and I did something I hadn't done in 26 years. I deleted the frames. I had them. Of course I had them. The half-second before my arms came down, my camera had still been firing. I had the fold, the gray face, the cut strings, 4 or 5 frames of the best and worst picture I'd ever taken. Worth more money than I'd see in 5 years. And I sat in my car in my own driveway, and I scrolled to them, and I looked at them, properly looked, and the man in them wasn't product anymore. The glass was gone, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one who sold that. I deleted every frame, and then I deleted them from the deleted folder, and then I sat there in the dark for a while, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, which was clean. I thought that was the end of my part in it. It wasn't. Because of what happened next, and what I knew, and the man who came after Sergeant Pell. Because not everyone thought Pell was a hero, I need to tell you about Cromarsh. Sir Hector Cromarsh was the king's private secretary, the most powerful man in the household, the one who runs the whole show, the diary, the message, the image. And the image was Cromarsh's god. He'd built his career on it. The hardest-working monarch in Europe, the 500 engagements, the never stops, never ages, robust old boy story, that was Cromarsh's story. He'd written it, sold it, protected it for years. And the king collapsing at the 500th was, to a man like Cromarsh, not a human tragedy. It was a catastrophe of message. The whole beautiful lie he'd built had folded onto a stone terrace in front of the world's press. And Cromarsh's instinct, I learned this over the weeks after from people inside who were sickened by it, Cromarsh's instinct was not gratitude that the king had been caught. It was damage. Specifically, a guard had broken protocol. A close protection sergeant had left his assigned position, crossed a public terrace, and put his hands on the sovereign in full view of the cameras, turning a moment that might have been managed, the king pausing, feeling the heat, retiring briefly into an undeniable photographed collapse with a guard cradling the king's head like something off a battlefield. In Cromarsh's mind, Pell hadn't saved the king. Pell had made it real. Pell had taken a controllable embarrassment and made it a global image of a frail old man. And worse, Pell had then shouted at the press, drawn attention, made a scene. There was talk, and this is the part that turned my stomach, there was talk of disciplining him, quietly. A close protection sergeant who'd abandoned his post and acted without authorization and compromised the dignity of the moment. They'd dress it in those words. The man who caught the falling king was going to be written up for catching him, because catching him in front of cameras was bad for the brand. And the reason I know all this, the reason I stopped being just a witness and became part of it, is that Cromarsh's office came looking for the photographs. Because here's the bind they were in. The collapse was out, half the world had seen the clips, the 2 or 3 shooters who kept firing had sold their frames, there was no putting that back. But the management of it, the spin, depended on the details, and one detail mattered more than any other to Sir Hector Cromarsh. He needed to know exactly what the cameras had caught. He needed the frames, all of them, ours included, to know how bad it was, what was provable, what could be denied. And his people had worked out that I'd had the best angle in the pen. The old fossil, dead center, clear line. They came to me, very polite, very quiet, an offer attached, a great deal of money, frankly, for the exclusive private transfer of my images of the incident, which is a clean way of saying they wanted to buy my pictures so they could control them and bury what needed burying. And I had to tell them I'd deleted them, which they did not believe. Nobody in that trade deletes the shot of a lifetime. They thought I was holding out for more. So Sir Hector Cromarsh's man leaned forward, in my own kitchen, and said the thing that put me square in the middle of it. Let's not play games, we know you have them. And frankly, given what's on them, a sergeant manhandling the sovereign, abandoning his post, creating a spectacle, you'd be doing the man a favor by selling to us rather than the open market. We're going to be reviewing the sergeant's conduct regardless. Your pictures will form part of that review. The only question is whether they form part of it on our terms or somebody else's. A thin smile. I'd think very carefully about which side of this you want to be on. And I understood, sitting there, what they were really telling me. They were telling me they were going to hang Aaron Pell. They were going to use whatever images existed to build a case that the guard who caught the king had behaved improperly, and they wanted mine to do it, and they were dressing the threat up as a favor. The man who'd reached the king before the cameras did, the man whose one word had broken 26 years of glass in me, and let me feel like a human being again, was about to be quietly destroyed for it by the one person in that palace who cared more about the image of the king than the life of him. And I was the only outsider who knew the truth of what I'd actually seen on that terrace. Not a guard manhandling a sovereign, a man who'd spent months getting ready, catching a falling king to the inch, and then turning to a wall of cameras and asking them, as one human being to another, to leave the old man his dignity. I looked at Cromarsh's man across my own kitchen table, and for the second time in a week, I felt the cold, flat thing in me get pushed aside by something warmer and a great deal more dangerous. I think, I said, you'd better go. I didn't sleep much that week. I'm not built for intrigue. I'm built for standing in a pen and pressing a shutter, and now I was in something and I knew it, and I didn't know the rules of it. What I had going for me was small, but it was real. I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. There were a dozen of us in that pen, 300 guests on that lawn, and Cromarsh could spin a still photograph, but he couldn't unsee it from 312 people. The trouble was that a thing everyone saw and nobody will say out loud is, in a place like that, the same as a thing that never happened. Cromarsh ran the story. The story was going to be what Cromarsh decided it was, unless somebody made it not be. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went back to being a photographer, but the right kind, the kind I'd forgotten I could be. I called Sadie first, the young one, the one who'd stood in the pen with both hands over her mouth and tears running and her camera down at her side. I half expected her to have moved on, to be chasing the next thing, the way I would have at her age. She hadn't. She answered on the second ring, and the first thing she said before even hello was, "Are they really going after the guard?" Because someone told me they're going after the guard, and I haven't been able to eat. That's how I knew I had her. The not being able to eat. The glass hadn't gone up on her yet, and I found I didn't want it ever to. Between us, over a few days, we did the unglamorous work. We went round the pen. Not all of them would talk. Old Marcus said it wasn't his business and put the phone down, and two of them, the ones who'd kept firing, were no use to anyone. But most of them, when you actually asked, when you said they're going to punish the man who caught the king, do you want to be part of that or not, most of them came good. Because here's the thing I'd forgotten about my own trade in 26 cold years. We're not all glass. We see more human moments than anyone alive, and it marks you. And most of us got into it in the first place because we wanted to witness things truly. The cold's a scar, not the skin underneath. And we had something Cromarsh hadn't counted on. We had the guests. 300 people had stood on that lawn. Charity people, ambassadors, decent ordinary worthies, and every one of them had watched a guard fly across a terrace and catch their king to the inch, and watched him cradle the old man's head off the stone, and heard him turn to the press and ask them, beg them, to leave the king his dignity. To those 300 people, Aaron Pell wasn't a protocol breach. He was the bravest thing they'd ever seen with their own eyes. And when the whisper started going round, quiet, the way these things go round, that the household was thinking of disciplining him, those 300 people did not stay quiet. You can manage the press. You cannot manage 300 ambassadors and charity patrons who all personally watched a man be a hero and are now hearing he's to be punished for it. The story got away from Cromarsh. That's the plain truth of how it turned. Not one dramatic stroke, 100 small ones. Guests talking. Photographers, the ones who'd lowered their cameras, telling people why they'd lowered them. Sadie, God love her, writing the whole thing up plainly and truthfully, what we'd actually seen, the months of preparation, the inch, the word, and it ran because it was true and people can feel true. The image of King Tobias that fixed itself in the kingdom's mind was not the collapse. Cromarsh had been so frightened of the collapse, but the collapse isn't what people remembered. What people remembered was the catch, the guard who got there first. The man who, with the shot of a lifetime available to a dozen lenses, said one word and most of them put their cameras down. It became, somehow, the opposite of what Cromarsh feared. It became the kingdom's proudest story about itself. Look how we treat our old king. Look at the man who caught him. Look at the press who, for once, chose the human being over the picture. Cromarsh fought it. Men like him always do, right up until the moment they can't. But you cannot discipline a man the whole country has decided is a hero, and you cannot run an image when the person whose image it is turns against you, which is the part I haven't told you yet, the part that finished it. Because the king got better, slowly. It came out, eventually, what it had been, his heart, the strain of it, the years of pushing, the 500 engagements that the doctors had apparently been begging him to cut for a year, and that Cromarsh had kept on the books because they were the story. The king had nearly worked himself to death to protect an image, and the image keeper had let him, because the image was the job. And when the king was well enough to understand what had happened on that terrace, and well enough to understand what was being done in his name to the sergeant who'd caught him, Tobias did the thing that the proud, stubborn, duty-bound old man turned out to have in him all along. He stopped pretending. I wasn't there for it. Nobody outside was. But it came out, the shape of it, the way these things do. The king called Cromarsh in, and the king, who'd spent years letting this man build him into a tireless monument, told him it was over. Not just the discipline against Pell, the whole thing, the lie. The 500 engagements and the robust old boy and the never slows. Tobias was 76 and his heart was failing, and he was done pretending it wasn't, done letting people be punished for telling the truth of it, done with a private secretary who'd rather his king die on his feet than be seen to sit down. Cromarsh was gone within the month. Resigned, they said, with the usual thanks. Nobody believed it and nobody needed to. And Sergeant Aaron Pell was not disciplined. Aaron Pell was decorated. There was a small ceremony, private. The king insisted no press, which I appreciated the irony of and which Pell, I'm told, vastly preferred. The king gave him something, one of the old kingdom's honors, the kind they don't hand out for show. And the thing I heard about that ceremony, the thing somebody who was there told me and I've held onto ever since, is what the king said when he pinned it on. He said, "You were the only one who didn't lie to me about what I was. Everyone else helped me pretend. You just got ready to catch me." And then, apparently, and this is the bit that does me in every time, the old king said, quieter, "Thank you for not letting them have the picture. A man should be allowed to fall in front of his friends, not his audience. You knew the difference. I'd forgotten there was one. A man should be allowed to fall in front of his friends, not his audience." I've thought about that line more than almost anything anyone's ever said to me, and it was said in a room I wasn't even in. Tobias slowed down after that, properly, cut the engagements by half, let himself be seen to rest, let the kingdom see an old man being old, and the strange thing, the thing Cromarsh never understood in all his years of image-keeping, is that they loved him more for it, not less. They'd loved the monument, sort of, from a distance. They loved the man. The frail, stubborn, honest old man who'd nearly died trying to be more than a man and finally let himself just be one. He had a few good years still in him, more than the doctors had feared. Slowing down, it turned out, was not the death he'd been so afraid of. It was the opposite. Pell stood near him through all of it the way he always had, still close, still on the weak side, still ready. Only now everyone knew why and nobody pretended otherwise, and I hope, it was a lighter thing to carry once it wasn't a secret. As for me, I went back to work, but I never went back behind the glass, not all the way, not ever again. I'd take the picture or I wouldn't, and I learned late at the very end of my career that the not taking is sometimes the better photograph. The one that exists only in the 300 people who were there, and in the man who was caught, and in the man who caught him. Some pictures you take with a camera. The best one I ever made, I made by putting the camera down. I retired not long after. Sadie's the one to watch now, if you follow that sort of thing. She's brilliant and she's kind, which the trade will try to take off her, and I tell her every time I see her, keep the kindness. The kindness is the eye. The cold's just the thing that grows over it if you let it. People ask me when they hear I was there what the moment was. The collapse they mean. They want me to describe the king falling, and I tell them they're asking about the wrong moment. The moment wasn't the king going down. Kings go down. Everyone goes down. That's just a body doing what bodies do. The moment was a man crossing a terrace faster than he should have been able to, because he'd spent months getting ready out of pure quiet love for someone who'd never once thanked him for it. And then turning to a wall of us, the cold and the hungry and the professional, and finding, somehow, the one word that reminded a dozen of us we were people. Don't. One word from the man everyone walked past, the furniture, the function, the guard you don't look at. He was the only one in that whole gold afternoon who was really paying attention. And when the moment came that he'd been quietly readying himself for, while the rest of us readied our cameras, he was already moving. Look at the quiet ones. The ones standing near the edges of the important moments, the ones it's nobody's job to notice. One day the thing everyone's been pretending isn't coming will finally come, and while the rest of us are reaching for our cameras, they'll be the ones already moving toward the fall. They're always the ones already moving.